The cold vacuum of space stretched out before the eclipse, the sleek human-built starship cutting through the stars with quiet precision. Captain Elena Rhodes stood on the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the vast, endless blackness beyond the viewports. For a brief moment, the enormity of the universe threatened to swallow her whole, but she pushed the thought aside. There was a job to do. "Captain, we're coming up on the signal's origin," said Lieutenant Juno Valens, the ship's science officer. Juno's alien heritage, a member of the sleek, cat-like Var people, made her an invaluable asset in deciphering the strange cosmic patterns they had been tracking for weeks. Her golden eyes flicked to the monitor, where a series of cryptic pulses flickered in and out of existence. "What's the source?" Rhodes asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Unknown. It's coming from deep within the abyss," Juno replied, the faintest tremor in her voice. The abyss was a region of space few dared venture into, a place where the laws of physics seemed to bend and reality itself felt warped. "The signal's frequency is unlike anything we've encountered. It's not random, Captain. This is deliberate." Rhodes turned her gaze to the viewport, where the darkness of the abyss loomed ahead. Even from this distance, it seemed to pull at the edges of the mind, a void that swallowed light and comprehension. She wasn't afraid of the unknown, not anymore, but the strange energy of the abyss unsettled her. And yet, the signal called to her. She could feel it. Something was out there, something old and powerful, just waiting to be discovered. "Plot a course," she ordered, her tone firm. "We're going in." The eclipse responded, its engines firing to life with a low hum. The crew braced themselves as the ship sliced through the dark expanse, guided by the strange whispers of the signal. Each passing hour felt like an eternity. Crew members worked in tense silence, their eyes glued to their monitors, knowing they were entering a place that held far more than just a simple message. Hours later, as the ship crossed into the outskirts of the abyss, something peculiar happened. The signal, once faint and distant, began to intensify, pulsing with rhythm as though it were alive. The bridge lights flickered momentarily, and the low hum of the ship's engines seemed to change pitch. It was as if the eclipse had crossed an invisible threshold. "Captain," Juno said, her voice barely audible, "I don't like this. The signal, it's getting closer." Rhodes felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She approached Juno's station, studying the readings on the screen. The signal's energy was growing stronger by the second, and it was no longer coming from a single point. It was everywhere. The walls of the abyss weren't just empty space, they were alive. Suddenly, a sharp beep from the communications panel drew the crew's attention. "Unidentified transmission," the comm officer reported. "It's a direct signal. It's speaking to us, Captain." Rhodes' heart skipped a beat. A chill settled over the bridge as the words appeared on the screen. "We are watching. Come closer." Before anyone could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Warning alarms blared as the eclipse lurched, its systems flickering. "What the hell just happened?" shouted Chief Engineer Kellen. "We've got a massive power drain. Everything's shorting out." "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Rhodes barked, but it was already too late. The eclipse was no longer in control of its own course. Whatever had been waiting in the abyss had just awoken, and now it was coming for them. This opening sets the tone for a slow burn of tension and suspense, introducing the mysterious signal and the crew's first unsettling encounter with the unknown. The eclipse trembled violently as it barreled deeper into the abyss. Captain Elena Rhodes gripped the edge of her command chair, eyes scanning the chaotic display on the bridge. The ship's once steady hum had devolved into a series of erratic vibrations, as though the eclipse itself was fighting to stay together. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the walls, and the sharp wail of the ship's alarms echoed through the corridors like the cries of a wounded animal. "Captain, we've lost auxiliary power," Kellen's voice rang out from the engineering console. It's not a system malfunction. Something is actively draining our energy. The engines are barely holding. Rhodes' mind raced. The signal, whatever it was, had done something to the ship. They were no longer in control. They were at the mercy of this region of space, this abyss that defied all logical explanation. Shut down all non-essential systems, Rhodes ordered, her voice calm but firm. We need to conserve power. Juno Valens, seated at her science station, looked up, her golden eyes wide with alarm. Captain, the signal, it's surrounding us. It's not just a communication, it's an energy field. It's everywhere. We're in the middle of it, Rhodes muttered. How long until we reach the source? Another hour at most, Juno replied, her fingers moving quickly across the console. But we're already seeing massive fluctuations in space-time. Gravitational distortions are spiking. This region, it doesn't obey the laws of physics. It's not natural. The ship rocked again, harder this time, throwing several crew members off balance. A low, eerie sound filled the bridge, whispers unintelligible at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. They're speaking to us, Juno said, her voice tight. But I don't know what they are. Everyone on high alert, Rhodes said, standing. Prepare for anything. As the crew worked to stabilize the ship, Captain Rhodes stood at the front of the bridge, staring at the viewport. The vastness of the abyss stretched before them, an endless ocean of darkness. No stars, no nebulae, just void. There was no sign of life, no markers, no structure. But the signal, those cryptic words, lingered in her mind, as though an unseen force were reaching out to her. Captain, Juno's voice snapped her from her thoughts. I'm picking up something, a planetary body. It's hidden inside the energy field. It's not on any map. The words made Rhodes' stomach tighten. Hidden. A planet cloaked by the same energy field that had already compromised their systems. Can we get a visual? She asked, stepping over to the sensor array. Juno adjusted the controls, and the screen flickered to life. A shadowed silhouette emerged from the void, an enormous structure buried beneath the planet's surface. It looked ancient, weathered, but unmistakable in its scale. It was like nothing Rhodes had ever seen. Too massive for a natural formation, yet it didn't match any known alien architecture. We're close, too close, Rhodes whispered. She knew they couldn't turn back now. The signal had been leading them here. And despite the gut-wrenching sense of dread settling over her, she couldn't ignore the feeling that they were meant to find this place. Set a course for the surface, Rhodes ordered, her voice steady. Prepare for landing. Let's see what's waiting for us down there. The crew didn't question her command. They knew the stakes. There was no going back. The Eclipse descended toward the darkened planet, its once pristine hull now battered by the unseen forces around them. The whispers intensified, echoing in the crew's minds like the voice of a distant, unrelenting predator. Whatever was waiting for them on the surface, they had no idea. But the universe had changed, and the Eclipse was about to uncover the truth of what lay in the darkness. In this section, the sense of mystery and danger escalates, pushing the crew further into the unknown, while keeping tension high with strange phenomena and an ominous sense of being watched. The Eclipse landed with a heavy thud on the surface of the planet. The ground beneath them was an uneven mix of jagged rock and twisted metal, remnants of something far older than anything humanity had ever encountered. Captain Rhodes stood, her boots clanging on the metal floor of the bridge as she made her way toward the airlock. The crew was ready to disembark, but there was a palpable unease in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on them all. Captain, something's not right. Juno's voice crackled over the comms as Rhodes entered the airlock. I'm detecting strange energy readings coming from beneath the surface. It's like the planet is alive. Rhodes paused. Alive, explain. I don't know how to describe it, Juno replied, her voice tinged with confusion. There's a pulse, rhythmic, almost biological, like a heartbeat, but it's erratic, almost as if it's responding to our presence. The hairs on the back of Rhodes' neck stood on end. Whatever this planet was, whatever the signal had been, it was no coincidence. They were being drawn here, like moths to a flame. Keep monitoring, Juno. We'll go in and see what we can find. Stay in contact. The airlock hissed open, and the crew of the Eclipse filed out into the alien landscape. The planet's surface was a barren wasteland, littered with crumbling stone structures and vast, gaping chasms that seemed to stretch down into nothingness. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that rang louder than any noise. No wind, no atmosphere, just cold, dead stillness. As Rhodes and her team moved deeper into the ruins, the first hints of what lay buried beneath the surface began to emerge. Large slabs of stone, intricately carved with symbols neither human nor alien could decipher, lay scattered across the ground. Every so often, they would find a fragment of something ancient, a broken statue, an enormous doorframe, a long-forgotten artifact, but it all seemed to be deliberately obscured, as though the planet was hiding its true nature. Juno's voice crackled through Rhodes' earpiece again, this time with a sense of urgency. "Captain, you need to see this. I've uncovered something. I think it's a structure, much larger than anything we've seen. And it's alive. I'm not sure how to explain it." Rhodes felt a knot tighten in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. "Lead the way," she said. The crew made their way to the center of the planet's ruins, where Juno had found something remarkable. Buried under layers of earth and stone, there was a massive cylindrical shape, half buried and pulsating with an unnatural energy. The structure was made of the same strange metal as the planet's surface, but it was much smoother, more refined, and far more ancient. As the crew moved closer, a low hum resonated from within it, vibrating in their bones. "This thing has been here for millennia, maybe longer," Juno said, standing next to a set of massive doors that led into the structure. It's calling us." Rhodes stepped forward, examining the doors closely. The carvings around the entrance seemed to pulse with light, and as she touched one of the symbols, a shudder ran through the ground beneath them. The structure came alive, the doors slowly opening with a grinding noise, revealing an interior that felt unnervingly familiar. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with eerie, glowing symbols that seemed to change the longer you looked at them. But it wasn't the alien script that caught Rhodes' attention, it was the central chamber. At its heart stood a massive crystalline object, pulsing with energy. It seemed to breathe, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "It's alive," Juno whispered, her voice barely audible. Rhodes felt a chill creep down her spine. The structure wasn't just a relic of an ancient civilization, it was a weapon, a trap, and it was waking up. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The air was thick with a strange static, and the whispers from the planet grew louder, more distinct. "We are watching. Come closer." A voice, not human, not anything they'd ever heard before. The whispers were not just sounds, they were commands. Rhodes didn't hesitate. "Get back to the ship. Now." But as the crew turned to retreat, the doors slammed shut behind them with an earth-shaking crash, trapping them inside the darkened heart of the ancient structure. And something was moving in the shadows, something that had been waiting for them. In this section, the mystery deepens as the crew uncovers the ancient Lurker structure. The feeling of being watched and the growing sense of danger ramp up, setting the stage for the chilling events to follow. The alien architecture hints at something far beyond their understanding, and the presence of the Lurkers begins to make itself known. The air inside the ancient structure grew thick and oppressive as the doors slammed shut behind the crew. The pulse of the crystalline object at the center of the chamber reverberated through their bodies, an unsettling reminder that they were no longer just visitors in an ancient ruin. They were intruders, and something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated was beginning to stir. "Captain," Juno said, her voice tense with panic. "The structure is resonating with energy. It's reacting to us. I don't think we're alone here." Rhodes could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise as she scanned the darkened room. The whispers had intensified, growing louder and more insistent, their voices now sharp and guttural. They were everywhere, swirling around her, in the walls, in her head. The chilling words seemed to speak directly to her thoughts. "Come closer, we are the Watchers. You will serve us." Rhodes clenched her fists. They weren't just trapped in the structure, they were being hunted. "Move out, stay close," she commanded, though her voice betrayed the fear she tried to suppress. The crew formed a tight formation, weapons drawn, as they cautiously advanced deeper into the chamber. The soft glow from the crystalline object illuminated the walls, revealing the same shifting symbols they had seen earlier, now glowing brighter, as if reacting to their presence. Lieutenant Zeke Hall, a seasoned combat specialist, led the way, scanning every corner for signs of movement. His eyes flicked nervously between the crew and the encroaching shadows. "Something's wrong, Captain. The air feels off, like it's pressing in on us." Suddenly, a sharp, inhuman shriek echoed through the chamber, piercing the silence. The crew froze, looking toward the far corner of the room where the darkness seemed to gather like an ever-expanding mass. Out of the void, a figure emerged, a distorted, twitching humanoid shape, its form shifting and melting, as though its very existence was an illusion. The creature's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. It let out another shrill cry and lunged at the crew. "Get back!" Rhodes shouted, firing her weapon. The beam collided with the creature, but it passed right through it, as though it wasn't even there. The figure staggered and then reformed, now more twisted and malformed, its body flickering in and out of existence like a broken hologram. The crew scattered as the creature lunged again, but this time, Zeke didn't make it in time. A flash of energy surrounded him, and before anyone could react, he simply disappeared, leaving behind only a ripple in the air where he had stood. "Zeke?" shouted Lieutenant Valens, her voice full of panic. "Where did he go?" There was no answer, just the sound of the creature's unnatural screeching as it vanished back into the shadows. The chamber fell silent again, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the tension of impending doom. Rhodes's mind raced. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a creature. It was something more insidious, something that could warp reality itself. The Lurkers weren't just observers. They were manipulators of the fabric of space and time, and they were playing with the crew as though they were mere toys. "Juno, what's happening?" Rhodes demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know," Juno stammered, her face pale as she checked her instruments. "The planet, the structure, everything's unstable. It's not just a physical attack. The whole place is bending, warping. It's as if the fabric of reality is being unraveled." Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than before, now more distinct and commanding. "One by one, they will fade. Only the worthy remain." Rhodes felt a sharp pain in her head, like her mind was being pulled in two directions. Her vision blurred, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But she fought it, pulling herself back together. "We need to get out," she said, her voice hoarse. "Now." The crew began backing toward the entrance, weapons raised, their eyes darting frantically in every direction. The hallway outside seemed to stretch longer and longer, the shadows growing darker with each step. They had only just begun to move when another figure emerged. This time, it was Juno, or what used to be Juno. Her face was contorted, her eyes glowing with the same unnatural light, her movements jerky and unnatural. She opened her mouth to speak, but the voice that came out was no longer hers. It was cold, guttural, alien. "One of you must stay." Rhodes fired without thinking, but the shot passed through Juno's form as though it were a mirage. The illusion of Juno flickered and then dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing behind, but the still suffocating silence. It was then that the truth hit them. They were being hunted, and no one was safe. In this section, the crew begins to experience the full scope of the Lurkers' power. The horrifying ability to manipulate reality, to create illusions, and to make people disappear shows just how dangerous their enemies are. The disorienting fear of being trapped in a collapsing reality adds to the mounting tension as the crew faces its first true casualty, setting the stage for even darker events to come. The crew of the Eclipse stumbled back through the twisting hallways of the ancient structure, their every step heavy with dread. Juno's disappearance, the way she had flickered and then vanished like a mirage, hung over them like a dark cloud. It was clear now that the Lurkers weren't just manipulating the environment. They were toying with them, distorting their perceptions, erasing their reality. Rhodes gritted her teeth, her pulse hammering in her ears. They had to get out of here. They had to regroup. But the longer they stayed in the structure, the less they could trust their senses. Every time they looked away, the wall seemed to shift, and the floor beneath them felt unstable, like the very ground was collapsing into the void. "We need to reach the ship," Lieutenant Hall muttered, his face pale, sweat beading on his brow. He was trying to keep calm, but even the hardened combat veteran could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pressing in from all sides. "Keep moving," Rhodes commanded, trying to sound confident despite the growing panic in her chest. "No one stop. We don't know what else is here." They reached the central chamber again, where the pulsating crystalline structure still throbbed in the center, like a monstrous heart. The air had thickened, growing colder. The whispers now seemed to be coming from every direction at once, like 1,000 voices vibrating in their bones. "You cannot escape." The voice sounded different this time, closer, sharper, as though it was speaking directly into their minds. Captain Rhodes clenched her fists, resisting the urge to look behind her. The walls themselves seemed to close in, and for a split second, she thought she saw something flicker in the corner of her eye, a shadow, a movement, or maybe a person. "Stay focused," she muttered under her breath, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the chamber, followed by a deep rumble, like something massive was moving underneath the floor. The ground trembled violently, throwing the crew off balance. Rhodes grabbed onto the nearest pillar to steady herself. "Captain, something's happening," Hall shouted, his voice strained. The crystalline structure at the center of the chamber began to vibrate violently, and the air around it shimmered with an unearthly glow. The temperature plummeted, and a blinding light erupted from the center of the structure, causing the crew to shield their eyes. A moment later, the light vanished, and what remained was nothing short of horrifying. A massive rift had appeared in the air, a jagged tear in the fabric of space itself. Through the tear, Rhodes could see a vast, black expanse, as if they were looking into the abyss of another dimension. The rift was alive, pulsing with energy, its edges writhing like a wound that refused to heal. And standing at the threshold of the rift, in the midst of the darkness, was a figure. At first, Rhodes couldn't make it out. The figure was a silhouette, vast and towering, its form shifting and indistinct like smoke. But as it stepped forward into the light, she could see its face, or at least what passed for one. The features were both terrifying and mesmerizing, alien, ancient, and somehow familiar, as though it was both a part of the universe and separate from it, a being that had existed before time itself. It spoke, its voice like a chorus of 1,000 voices, reverberating in their minds, not their ears. "You have come, and now you are ours." The air itself seemed to thicken, and the ground beneath them trembled again. The very atmosphere seemed to be breaking apart, bending under the weight of the entity's presence. Time seemed to slow, the rift widening as if trying to swallow them whole. The whispers grew louder, their words now clear and unmistakable. "Flesh and soul, join the others." The rift pulsed one final time, And then, as if by some terrible, inevitable force, the ground cracked open. A tidal wave of darkness surged forward, a flood of twisting, writhing tendrils that reached out for them. The ship, their only hope of escape. It was so close, yet it felt impossibly far away. Rhodes knew they had no time left. "Run!" she screamed. With every ounce of energy left in her, Captain Rhodes turned and bolted down the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The crew followed, panic fueling their legs as they sprinted toward the airlock, but the darkness was closing in fast. They could hear the rift behind them, its terrible, echoing whispers chasing them, the sound of something ancient and hungry. The airlock was only a few meters away now, but something lashed out from the shadows, a tendril of pure darkness that wrapped around Lieutenant Hall's leg, yanking him backward. He screamed, the sound cut off as his body was pulled into the void of the rift, his form vanishing without a trace. "No!" Juno screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the darkness. There was no time to mourn. Rhodes hit the airlock controls, the doors sliding open just in time for her and the remaining crew to scramble inside. The darkness lashed at their heels, but the moment the airlock sealed, the rift's pull ceased. They were safe for now. But as the airlock hissed closed, Rhodes stared at the now empty corridor. The image of Hall's vanished body burned into her mind. They had only just begun to understand the terrible forces at work here, and already it was too late. The Lurkers were coming. In this part, the crew's descent into horror deepens, with a full confrontation with the Lurkers beginning to unfold. The rift into another dimension and the appearance of the entity heighten the stakes, introducing a terrifying new element, the physical manifestation of the Lurkers. As the crew struggles to escape, they are forced to confront the truth. Escape may not be an option. The airlock doors slammed shut with a finality that sent a cold shiver down Rhodes' spine. The crew stood, panting, their eyes wide with terror, as they tried to steady themselves in the cramped confines of the ship. The Eclipse was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. The comforting hum of its engines now felt foreign, even hostile, as if the very ship itself had become an extension of the horror they had narrowly escaped. "Captain, what the hell just happened?" Hall gasped, his voice trembling. He was the last to board, his hands still shaking from the tendril that had nearly claimed him. Rhodes couldn't answer immediately. Her mind was reeling from the images burned into her mind, the rift, the entity, and Hall's disappearance into the abyss. She had seen something out of human comprehension, something older than time itself. "Is everyone accounted for?" she asked, her voice strained, trying to focus on the basics. Lieutenant Valens, her face pale and drawn, nodded grimly. "We've lost Zeke. And Juno," her voice faltered. "I don't know what happened to her. It wasn't her anymore." Rhodes nodded, biting back the bile that rose in her throat. The crew had suffered a loss, a terrible, unexplainable loss. The Lurkers weren't just threats. They were predators, erasing people from existence as easily as a person might erase a name from a ledger. "We need to regroup," Rhodes said, shaking herself from the paralysis of fear. "Juno's gone, Zeke's gone, but the rest of us are still here. We're not done yet." Hall, his eyes still wide and uncomprehending, tried to steady himself. "That thing, in the rift, it spoke to us, like it was calling us, like it knew who we were. Do you think it's still after us?" "We're not out of danger," Rhodes replied, turning toward the navigation console. She couldn't afford to waste time second-guessing. They had one chance to escape. "We're leaving this system." Juno's research should have mapped out enough data about the rift to help us pinpoint a safe route. But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. Could they really escape? The Lurkers were not just confined to that planet. That thing, whatever it was, had made it clear that it could reach into their minds, twist reality, make them forget who they were, or worse, make them disappear entirely. The crew moved in silence, working mechanically to reroute the power back to the engines. The ship hummed to life again, but it was a strained hum, like a wounded animal. They had left the planet, but not the threat. That much was certain. "Captain," Juno's voice crackled over the comms. It was a glitch, static. But then, something in the distortion caught Rhodes' attention. "Juno?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. The voice on the other end was not Juno's, but distorted, stretching and crackling with unnatural resonance. "You cannot leave. We will not let you leave. You will serve. All of you will serve." Rhodes felt a cold sweat break out over her skin. She knew then that this was no coincidence. This was not a simple trap or a random attack. It was a deliberate, calculated hunt. The Lurkers had been watching them all along, perhaps from the moment they entered the abyss. They had been drawn into a game they could not win. "Shut it down!" Hall shouted. "Shut down the communications. Now!" But it was too late. The ship's systems flickered, and the lights dimmed to an unnatural red hue. The voices on the comms came faster, louder, a cacophony of overlapping whispers that filled the room. It felt like the walls were closing in, the very ship itself becoming a prison, its corridors now stretching and shifting as the Lurkers bent reality to their will. Rhodes grabbed the controls, her knuckles white, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, we are not dying here. Not today." The ship's exterior began to shimmer, as if the very fabric of space around them was warping. Time itself felt unmoored, stretching, bending. She could see flashes of other places, vast alien landscapes, stars exploding in slow motion, the eclipse being torn apart by invisible hands. "We're in the rift," Valens whispered, her voice thick with dread. "We're still inside the Lurkers' domain." "No, we're not," Rhodes snapped. "We're leaving. We're taking control." But as she attempted to stabilize the ship's systems, a sudden jolt sent her crashing against the console. The ship's internal lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into darkness. Panic swept over the crew, and then, through the blackness, a terrible shape began to materialize in the center of the bridge. It was the same being from the rift, the towering, shifting figure, its form hazy and distorted, but unmistakable. "You are not leaving. You cannot leave. We are beyond time, beyond space. You are ours." Rhodes' blood ran cold. The Lurkers had crossed the threshold. They were no longer confined to the planet or the rift. They were here, on the eclipse. The air was suffocating now, pressing down on them like the weight of 1,000 suns. The ship groaned, as if resisting the force that sought to tear it apart. With the last of her strength, Rhodes slammed her hand on the controls, her voice hoarse as she commanded, "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We are not going down without a fight." But as she spoke, a realization struck her with terrifying clarity. It wasn't the ship that needed to fight. It was them. In this part, the crew's fight for survival escalates as the Lurkers' influence spreads onto the eclipse. The crew is no longer just struggling to escape. They are battling for their very existence. Reality itself is warping around them, and their isolation deepens as the true scope of the Lurkers' power becomes apparent. The eclipse groaned and shuddered, as though it were coming apart at the seams. The creature, the entity from the rift, towered before them, its presence suffocating, bending the very fabric of reality. Its form flickered like a broken signal, a grotesque fusion of light and shadow, its many voices melding together in a chorus of incomprehensible commands. "You will serve. Your flesh, your minds, your souls, all will become ours." Rhodes gritted her teeth, trying to steady her breathing. The last of the crew was huddled together, weapons drawn, but knowing they were no match for what they faced. There were no stars visible through the viewports now. The ship was lost, slipping further into the Lurkers' domain, and every second felt like an eternity. "Captain," Valens whispered, her voice taut with fear, "we can't outrun it. We're trapped. There's nowhere left to go." Rhodes clenched her jaw, staring at the shifting, monstrous form. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they could do. The eclipse had been designed to survive the impossible, but nothing in the ship's specs had prepared it for this breaking of reality itself. "I'm not giving up," Rhodes snapped, her gaze still locked on the entity. "We can fight back. We have to." The Lurkers' many faces twisted into something resembling amusement. "Fight? You cannot fight what is beyond your comprehension. You are prey. The hunt is over." The ship rocked violently, throwing them off balance. Rhodes barely caught herself against the console, staring at the flashing lights. The controls were flickering, almost as if they were being sabotaged from within. The power was draining rapidly, and every attempt to stabilize the ship only seemed to make things worse. The entity, or whatever it was, wasn't just attacking them physically, it was warping the very systems they depended on. "Hall," Rhodes barked, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on with the power systems? We need that backup reactor online, now." Hall had been at the engineering console, his hands flying over the controls. But there was an eerie calm in his movements now, as if something was starting to take hold of him. His face was drained of color, his eyes glassy. "It's no use, Captain," he muttered, as if in a trance. "It's all unraveling. It's like the ship itself is dying, but we're still here. We're still alive." Rhodes stepped forward, gripping him by the shoulders and forcing him to look at her. "Hall, listen to me. Snap out of it. We can still fight. We can still." But her words caught in her throat. As she spoke, the very walls around them seemed to dissolve, flickering away like static on a screen. The ship, their sanctuary, was no longer the ship. The real world was slipping away, dissolving into nothingness. The deck beneath their feet no longer felt solid. In the corner of her eye, she could see the corridor stretching endlessly, twisting like a ribbon, as if the ship itself was being eaten alive by the rift. "Captain," Hall's voice was no longer his own. It was softer, slower. "I don't think we're inside the ship anymore. I think we've crossed over. We're in it now." The words chilled Rhodes to the core. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were being erased from existence. The ship had become part of the Lurkers' domain, and they were no longer separate. They had fallen into the abyss. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the air, sharp and pained. Valen's body convulsed, and she collapsed to the floor, clutching her head, as though something was tearing at her mind. "No!" Rhodes shouted, reaching for her, but before she could take a step, Valen's body vanished, disintegrating into a cloud of particles that dissolved into the air. Another loss, another life stolen by the Lurkers. Rhodes' heart hammered in her chest. There were only 3 of them left now, her, Hall, and Juno, though she could barely think of Juno anymore. Her mind had cracked under the pressure, and what remained was barely human. They had all changed, warped by the relentless presence of the Lurkers, twisted into something else. "Why are you doing this?" Rhodes demanded, her voice hoarse but firm. "What do you want from us?" The entity's form rippled, its shifting faces flickering between grotesque smiles and monstrous snarls. "We do not want. We take. You are nothing more than fragments, pieces of a puzzle we are completing. Your minds, your souls, all will be part of the whole." Rhodes' breath hitched in her throat. It, whatever this thing was speaking in riddles, pulling at the threads of her very existence. The truth was becoming clear. This wasn't just a hunt. The Lurkers weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to consume them, to erase them from the universe, to turn them into nothing. Her mind raced. The eclipse was still here, still floating, still tethered to whatever horrible dimension the Lurkers had dragged them into. The ship could be their weapon, if they could just get control back. But first, they had to break free of the Lurkers' grasp. Hall was still standing beside her, his face slack, his mind slowly succumbing to the entity's influence. But there was something in his eyes now, something more than just fear. He was seeing it too, the unraveling of everything. "Hall, you have to fight it," Rhodes shouted, shaking him violently. "We're not dead yet. We will escape." But Hall's response wasn't what she had expected. His eyes, though clouded, seemed to focus on her with sudden clarity. "Captain, we don't escape," he whispered, his voice low and final. "We're the last, the only ones left to join them." And with that, he too vanished into the void. In this part, the crew faces the full weight of the Lurkers' power as they realize that the Eclipse is no longer a ship but a vessel within the Lurkers' domain. The boundaries between reality and the rift continue to blur, and one by one, the crew members are consumed by the shifting horrors of the entity. Rhodes is now alone in the fight, but the Lurkers' grip on the ship, and on their very souls, is tightening. There is no escape. Not unless they can somehow find a way to shatter the illusion and break free. The Eclipse had become a nightmare, a vessel adrift in the void between dimensions. Rhodes was alone now. The ship's corridors stretched impossibly in all directions, and the familiar, comforting hum of the engines had long since silenced. Everything around her had turned alien, distorted, twisted. The walls pulsed with a dark, rhythmic beat that sounded like the heart of some ancient creature, far older than the stars themselves. She could hear their voices, the Lurkers. "You will serve. You will join us. You are nothing without us." The words echoed in her skull, every syllable dripping with malevolence. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't stop the whispers. They were inside her mind now, inside her very being. "No," she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse. "I won't let you." Her grip tightened around the pistol at her side, the only weapon left on her after the others had disappeared. It felt like a lifeline, even though she knew it would do little to stop the horror stalking her. The ship was collapsing under the weight of its own unnatural existence, and Rhodes realized that the Lurkers weren't just trying to break her will. They were trying to erase her, to make her forget she was human. She had to hold on to her humanity. She couldn't let them win. She wouldn't. The control room was still within reach, if she could just get there. But with each step she took, the ship seemed to shift, its layout changing, the walls flickering between forms. Sometimes the floors turned to glass beneath her feet. Sometimes the walls melted away like fog. Reality was unraveling. The Lurkers had already broken through. The ship was being twisted into their domain. Rhodes stumbled, her breath ragged as the darkness seemed to close in on her. The doors to the bridge were just ahead. She had to get there. The console still had a working comms link. If she could send a signal, if she could warn someone, anyone, of what was happening, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. But the moment she reached for the door, it was gone. The corridor stretched out infinitely ahead of her, mocking her, swallowing her whole. She spun around, fighting against the disorienting pull of the void, but the ship was no longer hers. It belonged to the Lurkers now. "You are ours," the entity whispered. "You cannot escape." A cold surge of terror washed over Rhodes, but it was quickly replaced by a burning resolve. The ship may have been consumed, but she was still fighting. She wasn't just going to lie down and let them take her. Not today, she hissed through clenched teeth. She could feel something stirring within her, something beyond fear. It was the one thing the Lurkers had never counted on, her will. Her determination. She sprinted down the darkened hallways, the walls warping and bending around her, her mind buckling under the weight of the Lurkers' influence. But she pushed forward. She had one last trick to play. The backup reactor. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it could stop them. But it was the only option left. If she could overload the reactor and send a blast strong enough to tear a hole in the fabric of the ship, it might sever the connection to the Lurkers' dimension. The backup reactor was in the lower decks. She had to make it there. The ship shook violently, as if protesting her every step. The darkness around her grew thicker, more oppressive. The Lurkers were trying to drag her down, to swallow her whole, but she was close. She could feel it. The reactor was within reach. With one final push, she reached the reactor core. The room was dimly lit, the control panels flickering weakly. She slammed her palm against the terminal, her fingers slick with sweat, and activated the overload sequence. The countdown began. The ship groaned, a high-pitched hum reverberating through the walls as the reactor started to power up. The air thickened with tension. No, the entity's voice screeched, its presence now a constant weight on her chest. You cannot destroy what is already ours. Rhodes felt her body tremble with the effort to hold onto her sanity. The ship was tearing itself apart around her. The Lurkers were pushing, pulling, clawing at her mind. But she clenched her fists, standing firm. They weren't going to take her. The countdown reached its final seconds. "You are nothing," the entity howled, and Rhodes felt herself begin to break, her body threatening to disintegrate into nothingness. But then the reactor detonated. A blinding, deafening explosion erupted from the core, sending a shockwave through the ship. The walls collapsed, the ship's structure fractured. The rift that had been slowly consuming the eclipse imploded in on itself, unraveling the Lurkers' hold on reality. The entire dimension began to collapse. For a moment, there was nothing but light. Then silence. Rhodes awoke, gasping for air, her body slamming against the cold floor. She wasn't on the eclipse anymore. The ship was gone, and so was the rift. She was back in the cold, dark expanse of space, alone, floating in the void. The Lurkers were gone. The nightmare had ended. But as she stared out into the infinite darkness, Rhodes couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting, watching. The echoes of their voices still lingered in her mind. She had won, for now. But the universe was vast, and some threats were not so easily erased. In the final part, Rhodes makes a desperate stand against the Lurkers, risking everything to destroy the ship and sever their connection to the other dimension. The sacrifice pays off, and the Lurkers' grip on the crew is broken. But the victory is bittersweet, as Rhodes is left floating alone in space, unsure if the Lurkers are truly gone or if their influence still lingers, waiting for another chance to strike.